Hello and welcome back to the Fracking Farmhouse Climate Change Talk Chunk 2. I hope you watched the last one where I explained why I came to climate change. Chunk 2 is the science. Because before I was a gardener, I went to university to do physics. Would you believe it? But luckily I got out and into horticulture. But I do have a science background, so I understand what science is. And science measures real things. The scientific measure, the method, is you have an idea and then you test it and you see whether it's real or not. And you can measure things like temperature with a thermometer, and then you can make a different type of thermometer and you can check that whether against the other one, and then you can tell somebody on the other side of the world how you did your experiment, and they can build the same thermometer and they can test the same thing. And only when you've got repeatable experiments and people agreeing do you say that's the truth. You see, because you've tested it and it's evidence. And so that's kind of what. So I came to climate change because I could see it with my eyes. I could see it happening in the world around me. And science, as I say on this, measures real things. It measures temperature, and temperature is a form of energy. And from that you get to the laws of thermodynamics, which are dead easy. Think about a cup of coffee. If you have a cup of coffee in a room, it gets colder. You know, unless the room happens to be hotter than your cup of coffee, and then it will warm up. And when you put milk in your coffee, it mixes together because they mix and it goes to a state of entropy. And it's really simple, and people have been doing experiments all the time, and you know how much you heat things up. So the laws of thermodynamics are not challenged. You know, they're not. We know that they're real as much as we can measure them. So science measures real things, and in contrast, not real things, I would say, are things like nation states, money, religion. Now, I know that's a big statement. You know, money isn't real. Well, of course money is real and religions are real, but they depend upon people believing them. And that's the difference between science and these things. So climate change, you don't have to believe in it because you can measure it. You can do the sums and you can do the physics and you can prove it happens. You cannot prove that Christianity is better than Islam, or you can't prove that a loaf of bread is worth £1.20, or, you know, I mean, the EU could have decided that Greece didn't owe so much money. They could have just changed their minds. If I was born a Christian, I could change my mind and become a Muslim. And nation states are constructs. You know, am I in England or am I in Great Britain? Am I part of the European Union or not? Those are just decisions, and it wouldn't matter to my garden at work, and it wouldn't matter to the weather whether I was in or out of the European Union, for example. So, and I think this is a problem we have with politicians, because they believe massively in nation states, money and religion and things like that. These things give them power, and they don't quite understand that you can't vote against climate change. You actually have to do something, because climate change is real and it will happen because science says it will. And so we can measure temperature, and if you have a look at the global average temperatures since 1850, you can see that yes, they bounce up and down because Earth is a very chaotic system, but it definitely goes up. From the 50s onwards, it goes up and it accelerates going up. And if you look right at the right hand side, at the top of that range, you'll get, 2015. Actually, the hottest year we've had was 2016. So 2015 was the hottest year before that, when I noticed my crocuses flowering out of time. That was because that was the hottest year in the world ever. And 2016 is at the moment the hottest year, although 2019 looks level with that. And so you have to look at what's driving it, and we know we can do experiments to prove that carbon dioxide traps heat. in. We can prove it. We can take a box without carbon dioxide in, shine light in and measure how the temperature changes, and then we can put a lot of carbon dioxide in, shine light in and see how the temperature changes. We can prove that it's driven by CO2, and we can measure CO2 in the atmosphere by a CO2 in the atmosphere meter, which, if you look at this graph here, when it starts to get thick, this line, is because they've actually used a real meter in Hawaii to measure the actual CO2 in the atmosphere, and you see how it goes up, increasingly up. Before then, they have to rely on the little bubbles of air that are trapped in the ice in the Arctic and Antarctic, and you can take cores down, and the deeper you go, the further back in time you go, and you can take these at different places on the globe, and you can go down through glaciers as well, and they can correspond, so they can prove within reasonable doubt that this was the CO2 that level. And you can see on this graph from 1700s onwards, it's quite level, and then it starts to go up from the 1950s. That's just since 1700. We can go a lot deeper with these ice cores. We can go right down deep, and then we see that there is a cycle over time. And this is what a lot of the deniers go, oh, it's cyclical, you know, this will come round. And you can go, this graph here goes from 800,000 years ago, and you can see there is a cycle, and it peaks every 50,000 years, 100,000 years, something like 70,000 years. There's a peak, comes along, a regular peak of CO2, at around 300, and then it drops back down to below 200, then it peaks again. And that's the range that humans have evolved in. The trough there, the last trough there, was the last ice age, where human beings left the Euro-Asian landmass and went across to America and started killing all the large mammals that lived in America with these Native American Indians. By the way, these things are, the native indigenous people living in harmony with nature. No, when human beings got to the Americas, they killed all the big mammals. They did exactly the same in Australia. The forefathers of the Aboriginals, Homo sapiens, have never lived in balance with nature. They've always been very destructive. But anyway, if you look at the end of this graph, you will see that it goes from roughly 300,000 almost vertically up to 405 parts per million. It's now more like 410. This was February 15th, 2017. Because we've squeezed the time axis, that bit that looked relatively level in the first graph has been squeezed up. It's virtually vertical. Human beings have never breathed air over 400, well, human beings have never breathed air over about 310 parts per million, and we've gone a quarter again on that. So we are in totally uncharted territory. So just to recap, what are these greenhouse gases? Right, the greenhouse gases, and what do? So the sun comes in, it hits the Earth's surface, it warms up the Earth's surface. Then the heat from the surface of the Earth gets radiated out again, and if there was no atmosphere like the moon, it would all go out again in the same day, and then you'll turn round the next day and you'd start again sort of from zero, and it would heat up and go down again. And Earth, because we've got very little CO2 in the atmosphere naturally, most of our atmosphere is oxygen and nitrogen, which are not greenhouse gases. They do not trap heat, but water does. And so this is when I used to think that there will be big feedback loops, and water in the atmosphere and clouds have quite an effect. I think that explains the bumpiness of the graphs. But there are other things: CO2, methane, CFCs, HCFCs, NO2, and all the latter lot are from human pollution, and they all trap the thing. And you can see on these little pictures here, this year there's a few greenhouse gases that are bouncing, and see there you've got, C is a greenhouse gas molecule, and it's reflecting heat back down to the surface. But later this century, when CO2 has doubled, you'll see the heat that tries to leave the surface keeps hitting these greenhouse molecules, because they have bonds that can absorb heat and then reflect it back, some up, down, some down. So the greenhouse gases, we know how they work, we know the concentrations are going up, and you can see a breakdown here, the global abundances of major long-lived greenhouse gases, and they're all going up. Carbon dioxide, we've already dealt with, methane going up, nitrous oxide going up. The interesting one here is the CFCs, the blue and the red lines, and they're actually going down. And and the other ones, HCFCs, are going up, and we'll get to them, I think, in chunk 5. But that one gives me hope, because what happened with the CFCs is we realised what was happening. Not that they were greenhouse gases, but they were making a hole in the ozone layer. Governments of the world got together, banned them, and they are coming down now. That's the sort of action that is required if we are going to stop runaway climate change. So that's it. That's the science behind it. There is absolutely no doubt that the Earth is warming and what is causing it. And the bad news is there is no sign of it so much as slowing down at all. So the effects that have been predicted are not just starting to happen, they are going to accelerate. And so that is what we will deal with in chunk 3, what happens next. So come back to the next Fracking Farmhouse and I will tell you what's going to happen with climate change, and it's not a nice listen. Okay, thanks very much.